what's going to happen when the new rules come into effect is that the responsibility for carrying out that IR35 status assessment is going to shift from the personal service company, where it is at the moment, to whoever uses the personal service company services. So as end users of PSCs, it's going to be you. And that's one of the major changes. And that's obviously what happened in the public sector back in 2017. And I think what we're seeing is that there's a whole sort of layer of process that needs to be put in place to allow that to happen. The first question, I guess, is, well, who are we assessing? So that's why you need to know who your PSCs are. The second question is, well, how do we assess them? We may have a sort of high-level idea of what an IR35 test involves, but how do you actually implement that in practice? Because it's quite a complicated set of questions. I think what we're seeing emerging in the market, and certainly what happened in the public sector, was a range of services that are designed to provide an assessment tool. Now, obviously, the revenue have got its own status assessment tool called CEST. That has come in for a lot of criticism. I've certainly used it a few times, and so has Shaz and colleagues. It is, as with any tool, as good as the information you put into it. But the problem is, what you quite often get is a result that says undetermined. What you really need is something that gives you a conclusion, something that gives you a decision, so that you can you can notify who needs to be notified of that information and make sure that everybody is aware of what the status is and how tax needs to be paid. So that's the first big question, how do you assess? And James, I think we've got a session on that, haven't we? So you have to do that assessment. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but whatever assessment tool you use, whether you design your own or you use one that's made available by TXM or you go to a third party, you've got to be as confident as you can that it is addressing all of those points I've mentioned, and it is asking the right questions in the right way, so that you get a result which gives you some kind of certainty about whether that person is inside IR35 or outside IR35. And that's partly because, as an end user, under the legislation, you are under a duty to use reasonable care in carrying out your IR35 assessments. So what happened in the public sector was that a number of organisations were a little bit nervous about this whole thing. They were very cautious, and they just said, well, we're not going to carry out any assessments. We'll just say that anyone doing that role is inside IR35. It looks as if from the new draft legislation that that's not going to be enough. I think the Revenue do expect you to carry out some level of assessment on all PSC contractors. And I think at this stage in the game, until this is all bedded in and levelled out a bit in terms of what's compliant and what isn't, I think the best advice would be to carry out assessments on all PSCs, regardless of whether you think they're clearly inside or not. And the significance of that is because actually the Revenue, in many ways, cynically, is only ever going to be interested in an assessment of outside IR35, because as long as the tax has been paid, they're very unlikely to challenge it. That's the Revenue. The difficulty you're going to have is if you decide to do blanket assessments inside, you're going to have contractors jumping up and down, causing a bit of a problem. So, some degree of care needs to be applied in carrying out those tests. And again, if you're using the right assessment tool, that should happen for you. Once you've done the assessment, as the end user, you're going to be under a legal obligation to pass on the result of that assessment to the worker themselves individually, and also to the agency or staffing company with whom you are dealing. So if you're dealing with 40 different agencies, you're going to have to send out assessment results to 40 different agencies in respect of each contractor they supply. You've also got to send out the result to every single personal soil risk company contractor. So you can already appreciate that's going to be a bit of a logistical challenge if you haven't got a system that allows you to manage that. If you're dealing with one agency who then manages a number of preferred suppliers or second-tier agencies, you only need to send one notice to that agency. So it depends on how you've structured your staffing supply arrangements.